Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the life of Peter. And we're going to be talking about some of the events from Jesus' ministry in which he had with him Peter, James, and John, and just those three. I don't know why he chose Peter, James, and John. I've always felt bad for Andrew because there were four brothers who knew each other, who worked together, who probably grew up together. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Peter and James, the older brothers, and Andrew and John, the younger brothers. And and three of the four get chosen to go with Jesus when the others do not get chosen, and Andrew is left out. And do you know who tells us almost nothing about Andrew in the Gospels? Peter himself. um, in, in the in the Gospel of Mark. And I don't know why that is. The person who tells us the stories about Andrew is John, the other little brother of that foursome. John is the one who tells us over and over again about things Andrew did in the ministry of Jesus. But there were times when Peter, James, and John were with Jesus, just the four of them. Those three were closer to him than the rest of the 12 in some ways. And he had his reasons. Um, James would be the first to be killed. John would be the last to die. Peter would be the first leader, and the one they looked to for leadership. I don't know if any of that has anything to do with it. But the first time we read that Peter, James, and John are there and no one else is with the raising of Jairus' daughter, which is in Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 43. We're not going to read all of it because it's so long. And there's another healing embedded in it, which is the woman with the hemorrhage. This is given in all the synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew chapter 9, Luke chapter 8. But Mark's gospel is which is the shortest gospel, is the longest account of this event, and also it's the most vivid. And it's also the one that Peter himself is telling us, because Mark's source is Peter and Peter's preaching. And so that's the reason I want to read about this. Um, let's begin with verse 21. We're going to read through verse 24, then pick it up later in verse 35. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered about him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up to him, and seeing him fell at his feet, and entreated him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." And he went off with him, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman with a hemorrhage for 12 years came up. We have the story of the woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years, who, while this crowd is pressing in on Jesus, and he's trying to get to this little girl who is so sick, she reaches out and touches the tassel of his prayer shawl, the tassel of his garment that he would have been wearing around his waist, thinking, if I can just touch it, I'll be healed. And she is healed. And Jesus does not have primary agency in this healing. He feels the power going out of him. That is a really couple of really cool details that we can think about. Not necessarily completely master and process, but we can think about those details. That this miracle was not one in which he had primary agency. Her faith, which Jesus says, is what healed her, and that Jesus had a physical sensation when he healed someone. That's cool too. Jesus stops and and turns around to find who this woman is, and in a wonderful line, he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples say, "What are you talking about? Everybody's pressing on you. What do you mean, who touched you?" "No, no, somebody touched me." And the woman came out and told her story. And when Jesus hears her story, he says, "Daughter." He calls her daughter. He calls her daughter. "Your faith has made you well." Okay. Jairus has come to Jesus about his baby daughter. It's how he describes her, as a baby girl. And he says, she's sick. I need you to come. She's sick. So, but it's hard to get there because of the crowd and because he stops for this. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any more? But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, don't be afraid, only believe. I mean, we should have that on every car as a bumper sticker. If you got to get ink and you're going to have something tattooed on yourself, do that. Don't get ink. Anyway, don't be afraid, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. It's interesting that James is given priority and John is the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he beheld a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing, because the professional mourners are already there. Entering, he said, why are you making a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. And they laughed at him, but he put them all out. He took the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, we have the Aramaic, we have the very words that he said, so we know what it sounded like when it came out of his mouth. Talita cum, which means little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he said that something should be given her to eat. Oh, this is so moving to me as a father of daughters. No 12-year-old girl in the first century would be a Talitha. In the next year or so, she would become betrothed to a man. And then for another year or so, she would spend her days preparing to be a wife and being trained by the women of her village to be a wife. So that by the time she was 15, she would be ready to be married, 15 or 16. This is an adolescent on the verge of womanhood in their culture, not a baby girl. And this is the first resurrection story in the Gospels. There are 7 resurrection stories in the Bible, not counting Jesus' own resurrection or the valley of dry bones. I'm talking about when one man, empowered by God, says to a corpse, arise. There are 7 of those. One by Elijah, one by Elisha, one by Peter, one by Paul, and 3 by Jesus. This is the first of those 3. When Jesus talked to this 12-year-old young lady, he called her the same thing her father called her. He called her a little girl. Even today, when girls get married 10 years later than they did back then, no 12-year-old girl wants to be called a little girl. But that's how her father saw her. And that's how Jesus saw her too. And that's an important lesson to me. And Peter was there to see it. And when he told it exactly that way. And he used the very words that Jesus used, the very words that he will use almost later on when he raises the dead. Well, I'm wrecked now, so we'll pick up next time with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.